everyone. This is Dee Marley at the History Bards podcast. We have a great privilege of welcoming Gary D. Wilson to the show today. And just as a little brief introduction, Gary is the acclaimed author of 3 novels, Sing, Bonnie Blue, Getting Right, and The Narrow Window. And he is the winner of the 2023 Book of the Year Award from the Chicago Writers Association. Gary, we are so pleased to have you here today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about you and your writing journey and how you got to writing historical fiction?
I started writing inspired by a high school English teacher who was just a gem of a person. And she emphasized a lot of Shakespeare, interestingly enough, in her English classes. And we read Shakespeare aloud and didn't really perform it except with our voices. And that became an important thing to me, is hearing language used so meaningfully and so beautifully. So I decided I would try to write some of my own sophomoric attempts of kind of Mike Hammer, tough guy detective stories, and they were just disastrous. But anyway, I was doing it. And from there, went to college and stayed active in writing, but behind the scenes. I didn't do anything until after I got a master's degree in literature, and then I decided what I really want to do is creative writing, and I need some venue where I can just release that. So I decided to get a Master of Fine Arts, and did that at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. Very good experience. And from there, I basically began teaching, because that's what everybody with an English degree does.
Yeah.
So I began teaching, and I just in the last, I guess, 10 years, I retired from teaching and have been writing the whole time.
Okay.
And I did write. I've written for most of my adult life, so it's been something that I have found that I can't. I like to say I can't not do it.
Yeah.
This is too much a part of my identity.
Yeah.
To just sit back and not be involved in the process.
Yeah, I think we can all relate to that very well. And
Yeah.
I was going to say, we must have had the same English teacher, because I definitely had one exactly like that. She was she kind of inspired, well, that and my grandmother inspired my love for Shakespeare. And she did the same thing. So we would have classes where we would sit and read aloud. And one time we did perform a little scene out of Julius Caesar. But that was so much fun. But it definitely, when you have teachers like that, and kudos to all the teachers out there who are inspiring young people to write and to love literature. So between you and me, we can well attest to the fact that teachers have a great influence.
Yes, they absolutely do. And it's interesting you mentioned your grandmother, because I should give a acknowledgement to my grandfather, who was just a natural storyteller. And he had a very, very active imagination. And I remember he had one of those old time rocking chairs where it actually had rockers on the bottom of it, and he would sit in that chair and just rock kind of gently back and forth, and would catch the rhythm
Mhm.
of his storytelling. And
Oh,
it was just mesmerizing. It was like
yeah.
watching being hypnotized in a way. But so he was quite an influence as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. So yeah, all of those influences are great to have and inspiration for stories, everything. So can you tell us a little bit about your newest book and this the tell our listeners about what it's about?
Okay. I want to start by saying I have I've never uh, started any book project with the idea that it's going to be a certain kind of fiction.
Okay.
Um, and this one turned out to be identified not by me, but by other people as historical fiction.
Okay.
And I've never thought about it before, but the book is set in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in a very small country in southern Africa that was then called Swaziland
Uh-huh.
and has since been renamed by the current king as Eswatini.
Okay.
Um, and it involves, I should say, using present tense, it involves expatriate Americans who have joined, a man and woman couple have joined Peace Corps and volunteered and were placed into a school in this small country.
Mhm.
And um, the book follows a sort of heinous crime occurs in the first few pages of the book. It's a rape of the woman, and the story unfolds around their lives after this crime,
Okay.
and also involves another expat American who is uh, in the country as an independent contractor with the Ministry of Justice. He's
Mhm.
a lawyer. He gets assigned to their case because he's an American, and tries to mentor them through the whole process, the legal process that's going on. And in the midst of that, what I've tried to do is bring in a much broader perspective concerning the country,
Yeah.
its history, its customs, its belief systems,
Yeah.
what makes it tick and what makes it different from the American perspective. Um, and to me, that was just a fascinating process um, because I learned a whole lot um, through writing the book. And I have to say that it's based somewhat on my own experience and my wife's own experience of having served in Peace Corps um,
Okay.
from 1968 to 1970 um, in the country of Swaziland. So I had that
Wow.
immediate experience and knowledge of the country and its people. But over 2 years, you just barely scratch the surface
Yeah. And I
of
was going to ask you about that because I'm sure, like you were saying, it's so vastly different than what we're used to. So in your research that you did, and I'm sure, like even living there, you probably experienced a lot of the customs, the culture, the history, and all. Is there anything that specifically that you can share with us that was just so unique to you, or something that really stood out to you?
it. Yeah, it's quite different in the sense that the country is ruled by an absolute monarch.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, one of the last places on earth that has an absolute
Hmm.
um, ruler. When the country became independent, it was a British protectorate during the Boer War because the Boers wanted to come in and settle
Yeah.
Swaziland and take it over for themselves. And the Swazi government, or the king at that time, um appealed to the British to make Swaziland a protectorate.
Hmm.
And so that happened, and it gained its independence from that protectorate status in 1968. That was the year um, the Peace Corps group I was in went there.
Hmm.
Um, but the experience of living in a place that is completely controlled by a single individual was was an amazing experience, and to to know that the king's people, there's a very special relationship between the people of the country and the king, because he ruled by virtue of being able to basically captivate his people, and they believed he had almost magical powers, that he could create rain, and there were special rituals that reinforced this relationship, and it was real. It wasn't just fanciful. I mean,
Right.
people absolutely believed in his power, and he allowed, because the British required it, he allowed the creation or the election of a parliament to fulfill one of the needs of independence. And just after we left, he dissolved Parliament because he disagreed so much with him, even though he appointed almost everybody who was in Parliament. And so that was a really interesting learning curve.
I'm sure.
Um,
Yeah, I'm
and
sure.
another thing that we sorry,
No,
that
it's
we
okay.
we came to realize was that as teachers, we brought a completely different perspective
Hmm.
uh, to the classroom. And that, I think, one of the most profound things that we as teachers um, discovered was that as Westerners, and I guess I don't think particularly Americans, but as Westerners, the question why was the basis for almost everything we learned as people growing up. For the Swazis, the question why didn't exist in the language
Oh, that's
because
amazing.
it was it was a foreign concept,
Yeah.
and so we we always worried that you know through our method, I guess, which was to provoke independent thought,
Hmm.
that we were basically fomenting um, restlessness and potential revolution and so forth. And it was you know, we had students who would just shake their heads at us. Why do you have to ask why?
Hmm. But which
And
is
so,
really interesting because
yeah,
probably your experience was a lot like the early days of British history when the king had absolute rule. and the people were subject to them. So that's really interesting that even in today's society that still exists. You
Yeah,
would,
oh, yeah,
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 very
that's really
definitely.
interesting. So I'm sure that probably had a lot, that played a lot into your story.
It did. I tried to incorporate as much of that as possible. There's
Mm,
one chapter, in fact, that um, the woman whose name is Meg um, is a math and science teacher at the school, and she has a whole class devoted to um, fractions and trying to teach the concept of um, partial numbers. And she goes through, it becomes a real conflict of uh, cultural understanding and Western rationalism.
mhm.
She's trying to demonstrate that um, each day of the week um, is 1/7 of the week. And then they get into this whole discussion about, well, but there are only 5 days in a week because the kids only go to school 5 days a week. And so the rest of it didn't make sense. And it just goes back and forth and back and forth and back
Uh-huh.
and forth between these cultural misunderstandings
Mhm.
or learning points, as it were. Um, and so I tried to do a good bit of that in the book to highlight in somewhat playful ways
Yeah.
the differences in culture.
Yeah, well,
Um,
that's really, really interesting, and it's very intriguing, and that's one of the things that I'm sure that your readers are really going to want to read about and be very interested in. A lot of writers don't write about this kind of history and this area, so I think that in itself makes it very unique. So
yeah,
as a writer and writing about this kind of history and this era, this region and all, what kind of advice would you give like other writers who are starting out or younger writers? Like you were inspired by your teacher and as a teacher yourself, what would you say to someone starting out?
um, I think the advice that I give most people is read,
Yeah.
read all kinds of things, not just you know things that you're most interested in.
Yeah.
Uh, Read fiction, read nonfiction, read genre fiction, read mysteries and romance and stuff, because you can, as as a beginning writer, you can learn
Yes.
how these writers succeed in getting their stories told.
Yes.
And that I think is the single most important thing. And also to practice your craft, whatever it may be, uh, because you get better as time goes on. You
Yes.
become, as I used to say in the classroom, you eventually, after enough practice, become your own best critic.
That's very
And
true.
and that's really important because I I also counseled my students not to ever write with someone standing behind you looking over your shoulder, because that's the thing that will ruin your writing
Yeah.
uh, very quickly.
And
And
if you're like me, and for most people, we don't like that anyway.
no,
I
no,
don't
no,
I don't
absolutely,
like to
absolutely.
anybody to see what I'm working on.
I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
And I usually, in terms of that, I usually don't share something until I'm satisfied with it,
Yes.
and then I can share it with a select group of people. The people I do share it with, I swear them to honesty above all else.
Yeah.
If they hate it, tell me they hate
Yeah.
it and why they hate it. And because I'm not going to be offended. I've been doing this too long to be offended by somebody disliking something.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's a good point too, is writers having learning how to have thick skin,
oh
because
yeah,
as writers we feel like, oh, I've written this, everybody should want to read it, and then when you start getting in the reviews, and some of them not so good, and
yeah,
you can kind of be, as a young writer, you can kind of be kind of sensitive about that, and so
oh
you
yeah,
have to learn to take it and learn from it, because it actually in some ways will teach you to be a better writer.
oh absolutely, absolutely. And I've learned also that um, if one person is critical of something in your writing, that's fine. You can say yes, no, that doesn't make any sense. But if five people say the same thing,
Hmm.
you might want to start paying attention.
Yes, I
Um,
agree.
so I think that's a a good point to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. So with your new book, the one that you were just talking about, what's the title of it?
It's called, well, here, I'll
Yeah, show it
have
to
a
us.
copy right here.
Okay, The Narrow Window. Well, great. So this one's out now. It's available on
Yes,
booksellers, Amazon, all of those
it
things.
it was released March 1st of this year.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yep.
And are you having any kind of events coming up that anybody should know about, that they can come meet you and get a signed copy?
Um, yeah, I had the book launch on March 1st here in
Hmm.
Chicago.
Hmm.
I will be trying to arrange some other events, which I
Okay.
would list on my website,
Okay.
that
And
would be upcoming.
tell everybody what that website is, so we'll post it on the screen as well.
It's Gary D. Wilson, all one word, .com.
Okay, and we'll make sure we'll post that on the screen so that everybody can go and find out where you're going to be and find out about those upcoming events so that they can come meet you and get a signed copy. And then if there's anything else coming up, like my next question is, what's your next project? Are you working on anything?
Um, I'm not, but I have something in mind. I did the story collection that won the Book of the Year award. Was something I've published stories, my whole adult life, but I was always working on something and never got around to putting a collection together. And I finally did, ironically, during the pandemic,
Yeah.
because I'm a hermit anyway, but that made me even more of one.
Yes.
So I put that collection of stories together. Plus, I finished the Narrow Window,
Mhm.
and I do have at least one more collection of stories that I want to get together. Uh, Plus, if I make it that long, I would like to do a book that would be a companion, not particularly a sequel, but a companion to
Uh-huh.
The Narrow Window,
Okay.
following one
And
of
it's
the characters to new adventures.
Yeah, it sounds like that it would be a good fit for that. Yeah, definitely. Well, Mr. Wilson, Gary, we really do appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and I appreciate the chance to meet you and to discuss.
Absolutely. Thank you. And again, to all of our listeners who are out there today, we're going to post Gary's links up on the website and on YouTube. Don't forget to come to our YouTube channel and subscribe. And to all of our listeners, this is Dee Marley at the History Bards podcast. Keep making history and keep living.